Hi, I'm Dr. Robin Koslowitz, YouTube's post-traumatic parenting expert. Today we are going to talk about the Ruby Franke, Jodi Hildebrandt 8 passengers scandal, and I want to unpack some of the psychological concepts behind what was problematic in this channel, in this therapeutic relationship. People have been throwing around terms like dual relationship, like natural consequences, like punishment. And I really want to unpack how we understand this. If you like this type of content, please subscribe below. If you're a post-traumatic parent on a journey trying to learn about how your trauma has impacted your parenting and what to do about it, consider reaching out. I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on Instagram at Dr. Koslowitz Psychology. That's also where the most supportive and amazing community of post-traumatic parents hang out. We have a subscription channel. We have a broadcast channel. We have a lot of ways to directly DM me and interact. I go live on Instagram a lot. So if you like this video, but you had specific questions that you don't feel like I answered or addressed, and you really want to hear about something very specific, please DM me on Instagram, reach out, participate on a live, and I will be glad to answer those questions. Remember that YouTube is not psychotherapy. Nothing that I say on this channel constitutes professional psychological advice. This is purely psychoeducation for post-traumatic parents who want to understand these concepts better. So let's understand the whole 8-passenger saga. I want to localize myself within this. I am a post-traumatic parent. I am not a follower of 8 passengers. I have not consumed their YouTube content. I do not know Jodi Hildebrandt. I know she is a licensed mental health counselor, although now her license has been revoked. So I know about that. I can certainly comment knowledgeably about the professional boundaries and ethics that she seems to have ignored, but I don't know her personally. I wasn't a fan of the channel, so it's not like I have any insider information. So let's discuss several issues with the controversy. So just for anybody who's unfamiliar with the controversy, Ruby Franke was a popular YouTube family vlogger. She, at the height of her popularity, she had 2 million followers. She would post about her family's day-to-day life. She would post about her parenting practices, the way her faith impacted her parenting, and later the teachings of Jodi Hildebrandt, who was a parenting coach that she was following. Now, one important thing to know about family vlogging is I have serious concerns about any content creator using their children in their content in any way. I feel like children are not capable of consenting. They're certainly not capable of the informed part of informed consent. So informed consent means, we hear about it all the time. You go to the doctor and they're like, sign these informed consent forms, and you just kind of sign them. And we don't necessarily think, what am I signing? It's just another form to fill out while my kids are fighting on the floor in the dentist's office. What an informed consent form is supposed to be is, I am informing you so that you know, because you are an agent, you are an adult who has agency, and you know the risks and benefits of consenting to this procedure. So when you come into a psychotherapy practice, there's an informed consent, which is psychotherapy might sometimes bring up painful thoughts and feelings. You need to know that before you sign on. Just in case you thought therapy was going to be all sunshine and rainbows and it's about making you feel better, sometimes we have to make you feel a little worse before you feel better. You need to know that before you sign up. When you go to the dentist, they warn you about the risks and benefits of the procedure. On the one hand, this procedure is going to hurt. You're going to feel some tenderness in your gums. There have been people who have had rear reactions to the anesthesia and have died, right? You need to know that. On the other hand, your very painful cavity does need to be filled in. You do need this root canal, right? That is how informed consent works. The informed part of informed consent means you understand well the risks and benefits. It's not supposed to be a form that you scribble and sign without, even reading it. Children lack the frontal lobe capacity to consent because they can't really weigh risks and benefits. So a child who's on a parent's YouTube video might not be aware of the problematic interest of people who fetishize children. They might not be aware that they could be teased about something that they post. They might not be aware that this is going to impact their reputation forever. All they know is like, mom said I could get a jawbreaker after I shoot this video. That kind of informed consent is problematic because they simply don't have the executive function to understand the concept of the internet is forever. So from that aspect, children cannot consent because they can't be informed, right? They don't fully understand what they're consenting to. There's another problematic aspect, which is consent. When is consent consent? One of the concerning videos or series of videos on Ruby Franke's YouTube was she posted ads for pull-ups for her children who were bedwetting, who were supposed to talk about their struggles with bedwetting and how these pull-ups were helping them. The child was participating in the video, so they must have in some level consented. But can a child really consent when it's their parent asking them to do something? Their parent's in charge of their survival. Their parent is the person they look up to. Their parent's their attachment figure. So maybe to make mom happy, I'll agree to participate in this video, especially if mom says, this is how we're paying our rent. This is how we support our family. You liked our trip to Disneyland last summer, didn't you? Well, this is how we afford it. So the child wants to please the parent. The parent wants to please an algorithm, which makes sense. Algorithms are hungry creatures, and algorithms tend to really capture our psyche and capture our decision-making capacity, especially when there's a lot of money involved. So is the child really consenting? Is there really a 7-year-old boy who wants to be shooting a video about wetting the bed? I would maybe hope in a perfect world when people are so comfortable with vulnerability and authenticity, maybe. But in this world where children are cruel to each other, I just can't imagine a child consenting for any reason other than I want to keep my mom happy. So in that sense, the consent is problematic. So the informed part is problematic. The consent part is problematic. Then we get into some of the parenting practices that Ruby Franke used. And again, just documenting children's lives, the good, the bad, the ugly, the throwing up on the bathroom floor, the fights, the struggles. Do children really want that documented for the world? Personally, I think it's one of the best decisions I ever made before I started my social media journey, when my agent told me that I need to increase my social media presence so that the post-traumatic parenting book will get out there into the world. It was a decision I did not take lightly at all. I sat down with family members. I sat down with advisors. I sat down with people who had done it to really map something out. And before I even established any presence on social media at all, I created some red lines for myself. One of those red lines was, you will never see my children's faces on my social media. There is an occasional time where one of my kids is walking by. There's an occasional time that one of my kids runs over and gives me a hug and you see the back of their head, but I won't post their faces. I also won't post stories about them unless it's very, very anonymous. Like, I have many children, so I can, sort of hide which child I'm talking about. Happened a long time ago in the past, and that child is now an adult, and I can ask for informed consent. Do you mind if I tell that story that happened when you were 8? I have very strict guidelines about that, simply because I think that once algorithms get involved, once profit gets involved, once other people's opinions get involved, it's easy for us to lose our sense of values. And something that would have been unthinkable a year ago suddenly becomes, oh yeah, everybody's doing it, it's fine. I never want to go there. So I, every so often, periodically review my parenting value statement vis-a-vis social media. Like, what are my values around social media? Am I sticking to my values? Am I making sure that my social media presence continues to adhere to those values. And one of those values is children cannot consent, therefore children cannot be on social media. There are other people who are also mental health professionals who do include their children, and they have their own values and their own guidelines. And as long as those values both work and were vetted by someone with more expertise and less self-interest than ourselves, I think that's fine. I think different families are going to have different standards and different levels of comfort and familiarity with what they're posting, but there needs to be someone else, someone wiser, someone who doesn't have self-interest involved, who gives us guidelines for what we do and we don't post. And every so often we check in, was that okay? Are we still sticking to those guidelines? Did we move past or away from something that we used to believe was a red flag or a red line that we wouldn't cross? So I feel like what happened with Ruby Franke perhaps is that the algorithm got hungry and she started posting more and more problematic content. Then we go into her parenting style. And here's where something else becomes a little confusing. She talks a lot about natural consequences. So let's understand what a natural consequence is. In and of itself, natural consequences are not a bad thing. Natural consequences means sometimes allowing a child to fail, sometimes not shielding a child from the consequences of their behavior. Like, I can nag you to clean your room all the time, or I cannot nag you, and then you can't find your soccer uniform, and then you're late to practice, and then the coach makes you run laps. You know, had you cleaned your bedroom Wednesday night when it was your chore night to clean your bedroom, you would have been able to find your soccer uniform, which meant you would have gotten to practice on time, and then you wouldn't have had to run laps. I'm not gonna, leave work and run home and drive you there so that you still make it on time. That would be a natural consequence, right? I'm not gonna invent a fictional, grandparent's funeral to get you out of having to do your science project because you chose not to do it. That's what a natural consequence is supposed to be. And sometimes a natural consequence, when it's developmentally appropriate and it's in line with what the child is capable of doing, makes a lot of sense and is not a bad thing. But Ruby Franke seems to mistake natural consequences and punishment for each other. She also didn't understand the developmental appropriateness aspect of it. So in one video that went viral, Ruby's daughter's kindergarten teacher, the daughter was 6 years old, called and said that texted and said that her daughter had forgotten lunch. And Ruby said, well, then let her be hungry. I am not driving and bringing her lunch. She later clarified that the school was 45 minutes away, which is kind of far. But then she said, please don't give her food from yourself. Please don't ask other children to share food with her. Let her be hungry so then she'll learn. To me, that is adding punishment on top of natural consequence. The natural consequence of like, oh, I left my lunch at home and I really wanted my Lunchable. I really wanted my drink box. I was so in the mood of that lunch that I packed for myself. And now I have to get, some apple and some crackers from the school cafeteria, and that's not nearly as yummy. That's already a natural consequence. You don't actually need to feel hunger, which hunger is a survival thing, right? When we're hungry, that's a survival instinct. That's our body saying to us, you are not safe, you lack nutrients. When a child is in a hungry state, and I mean truly hungry, not just like, oh, I'm in the mood of munching, but like I'm actually feeling hungry, that body is then feeling unsafe. An unsafe body is a brain that is not ready to learn. So if the child's stomach is sending true signals of, I am hungry, I need lunch, like not just I would like some snack or like those animal crackers are yummy, I'd like a few more, but I'm actually feeling hunger, that's not a child who's in kindergarten ready to learn. That brain is focused on survival. That's raising the chance that the child develops a trauma app later on in life. It is not a good thing. Obviously, the occasional hunger, the occasional, kid who decides not to eat their lunch because they're playing outside and then they're hungry in class and the teacher says, nope, you can't go out and eat now. You're going to have to wait till our next break. Probably not going to traumatize the child, but lunch is a main meal of the day. Skipping snack at recess in favor of a baseball game is one thing. Lunch, though, is a main meal of the day. So the natural consequence of forgetting lunch is having to go to the teacher and say, I forgot my lunch, feeling a little, I guess, embarrassed maybe, having to eat something that's not your preferred food from the school cafeteria or a friend who's going to share something with you, that's already a natural consequence. That kind of like, oh shucks, I don't have my actual lunch that I wanted. A natural consequence is not, and don't you dare give her food because I want her to feel hungry so that she learns. There's this misperception that a lot of us grew up with and that we really want to actively get rid of, which is that we can only learn from pain. That's not true. We learn from pain to become hypervigilant and traumatized. We don't learn from pain good, appropriate lessons. Having her mom, and by the way, I get that the school is 45 minutes away, but we do live in the age where she's a vlogger, so presumably she knows how to use social media, Uber Eats, call the local store. If the school has a like no food policy, they have no food there whatsoever. I don't know, give the teacher your credit card number and let her swipe it in the vending machine. Tell her you'll send whatever she buys your kid, you'll send her the money tomorrow. Uber Eats some food to her school. I don't know, this might have been in, before Uber Eats, but call a local store and have them deliver something. There are options. There are many, many, many options. I can't imagine if the teacher would not be able to somehow scrounge up a lunch of some sorts for this child. Like I said, I'll pay you back, get her some pretzels from the vending machine in the school, and I'll send it to you tomorrow. I'll send you some money tomorrow. There are a lot of options for getting your kid food. I think that a natural consequence also has to be developmentally appropriate. Is a 6-year-old capable of enough executive function to be able to say, oh, if I don't take my lunch now, I will feel hungry later? It's just entering the edge of their capacity. Not quite there yet, right? When you have those like chronic bedtime procrastinators, hi, I'm one of them. To a certain extent with a child, I always look at that developmental shift where the child says, I really better go to bed because I'm going to feel tired tomorrow, as a sign of increased frontal lobe capacity. I don't usually see that in kids before like 11, 12, unless they have a chronotype that's very, their sleep cycle is just that they really feel a demand for sleep when they're tired. But most kids, an 8-year-old who's having fun playing with their sibling and, running around, doesn't want to stop screen time, and a parent says, okay, it's bedtime. The 8-year-old does not say, oh yes, I don't want to be tired tomorrow in school. I'll go to bed now. The 8-year-old's like 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes, 15 more minutes. I guess I have an inner 8-year-old because I am a chronic bedtime procrastinator, but I do have the frontal lobe capacity to know I'm going to be tired tomorrow. An 8-year-old might not, an 11-year-old should. So 6 is a little young. Kindergarten's a little young to have an expectation of that full sense of I'm going to take responsibility. Also, I think one of the things she may have been reacting to was she said her daughter told her, yeah, Ma, I packed my lunch. And yeah, it is a little frustrating when our kids don't tell us the truth. It's a little frustrating when our kids want us to be their frontal lobes. Like, let me check your backpack and see, is your lunch really in there? And then I have to run back into the house and get it for you. And when you have 6 kids, I can get that that's frustrating and that adds a lot of mental load to the mom. So I can understand her feeling frustrated and annoyed. Like, she told me she packed her lunch. I get that. But frustrated and annoyed is not why we make a parenting decision. We feel frustration and annoyance. We say, thank you, anger, for telling me that this is an annoying experience. Anger identifies a problem. You're right, I'm annoyed, and I need to make the best decision for my child. Let me and my child's teacher, let's put our heads together and come up with some sort of a solution so my kid's not hungry. Yeah, she might not be fully satiated. The teacher might find her a bag of pretzels and an apple, and that's not the best lunch, but she's got nutrients in her system. She's got enough to tide her over till she gets home. I agree she wasn't in actual danger. This isn't a kid who's been like starved for multiple days, but it still puts the child in a situation of stress that's a bit above their developmental capacity. I could sort of see telling an 11-year-old, use your pocket money in the vending machine, right? You forgot your lunch that you were supposed to remember. You have pocket money. You have your allowance with you. Spend your own money. I can totally see saying that to a child, but that's an 11-year-old, not a 6-year-old. There were a lot of parenting videos where she talks about natural consequences, but then she's actually referencing punishment. Not the same thing. when she brings her children on the channel to chastise them publicly for 2 million people to watch. Shame is not a teaching tool. Shame is a punishment. It's not a natural consequence. Nowhere in nature are there 2 million people watching you be humiliated. So that's not a natural consequence. Yes, you and me having a conversation about something might be a natural consequence privately, but having that conversation in front of 2 million people and whoever decides to log on, maybe your classmate, maybe your best friend, maybe the girl you have a crush on, that's not a natural consequence. She then talks about punishment and having to intensify the child's discomfort. So she feels like her children are not humble enough, not demonstrating enough humility. So she's going to take away their holiday presents so that they learn humility. First of all, I'm not sure how does taking away holiday presents lead to humility? I think taking away holiday presents might help with selfishness. Maybe if a child's a little too unaware of the plight of other people who don't have nearly as much, maybe, but I don't see how taking away presents equals humility. And she said, children look forward to getting their presents all year. So this is maximum pain or maximum discomfort. I'm not sure what words she used. We don't need to feel discomfort to learn a lesson, right? We don't. Discomfort is the natural outgrowth of upsetting experiences. And sometimes we learn from those experiences. But the best way we learn from our parents is through shared joy, connection, attunement, shared delight, the desire to be seen and be heard. So when a child comes home from school and says, somebody was mean to me, even if we have some concern about the child's behavior, we don't right away go to, well, I told you, if you keep talking too loudly and standing too close to people, they're not going to like you. Of course they were mean to you. Even if that's how we feel, we first say, I know, that must have been painful. I'm so sorry that happened to you. That wasn't okay that kid did that to you. That's the name they called you. We want our child to feel really seen and really heard. And then much later, we might say, remember those skills that your social skills teacher taught you about standing the right amount of distance and levels of energy and how we talk? Practice those a little bit more. You haven't been wanting to do that homework. And sometimes when you don't do that homework, you forget. And then these things start happening. So let's see if we can practice those skills. That is how we take making the child feel seen and heard and supported, and then extend it to learning a skill. Punishment and discomfort in and of itself is not a teachable moment. It's the opposite. Then there were some other parenting practices like taking a child's bed away for 7 months and making him sleep on a beanbag, taking off the door of a teenager's room because he doesn't deserve privacy. While I'm not the biggest believer in children having all sorts of rights to privacy, I especially believe that in their online lives, they should be monitored. And I certainly believe that I am not a big believer in children secreting themselves away from adult view, especially if there's a kid over that's not someone I know well. I have a policy. We have a play date. We can play in the playroom. The door stays open. Or I might be checking on the cameras just because I don't know this kid. I don't know if something's going to happen that will be inappropriate, dangerous, scary. So I'm going to monitor you, but not allowing a teenager to have a door in their room seems a bit excessive. So I can hear those concerns, right? My kid might be doing something online that I don't like, but that's online. A bedroom is also where you change your underwear. A bedroom can also be where you might be sleeping in a really embarrassing position. It just feels a little unsafe. And I think different families have different rules and different policies about that. But certainly taking away a bedroom, having a child sleep on a beanbag. She also talked about you children don't have the right to meals. Meals are a privilege. Meals are not a privilege. Privileges are privileges. Screen time might be a privilege. Going to the playground might be a privilege. Going to Disney World might be a privilege. But meals are not a privilege. Clothing is not a privilege. A bed is not a privilege. Those are rights. Perhaps in a family that's extremely poverty-stricken, it might be something that the parents can't quite provide perfectly. But even in a family that's poverty stricken, food is not something that should be a privilege. Food might be something that's unattainable, that the parents feel as bad for the kids. I have worked with families that were really economically challenged. And I've talked to parents who were getting food stamps and it just didn't cover enough food. So the mom was going hungry to make sure that her kid could have a second helping because he was a growing boy and he just wasn't full on one dish of mac and cheese or whatever she was able to get. I spoke to a mother who used to go to 3 different food pantries walking around town because she couldn't even afford gas so that she could get enough food to supplement any other food she was getting while her husband was withholding child support payments and there was no money. Feeding her kids was her top priority. Making sure they had food to eat when there was no free lunch day because school was out during COVID. This was the thing that consumed her. In her family, eating something more expensive was a privilege simply because it didn't happen very often. And that's not even a privilege. That's more of like a bonus. It's an exciting treat. But it was never a privilege. It was something that as the mother, she felt, and I was just in awe of this mother, she felt, I need to provide my kids food. I need to do whatever it takes to make sure there's food on the table. Food's not a privilege. A bed is not a privilege. Clothing's not a privilege. These things are rights. If you cannot provide those 3 things, you need to figure out how to provide them, but you certainly don't withhold them as some sort of a consequence or punishment. So, right, there's that level. A child is not taking care of an expensive possession properly. It makes sense to say, until you can play with this toy properly, I'm going to take it away. I'm going to hold on to it for you for a while. That is a privilege. You have this really, really, really expensive designer t-shirt that someone gave you as a gift and you're not taking care of it properly. I think we're going to save it till you're a little older and you can take care of it properly. That's okay. That's a privilege. But actual clothing, actual beds, actual food, not privileges. Now let's turn our attention to the other half of the story, Jodi Hildebrandt, who was a licensed mental health counselor who was working with Ruby Franke on they started some sort of a parenting coaching program online. They had a podcast where they were talking about parenting and their very extreme views on parenting. So the first thing I want to talk about is, it's been thrown around a lot, the idea of a dual relationship. So what is a dual relationship? A dual relationship is a relationship where you have one role and then you have another role with the same person. So if Ruby Franke is coming to Jodi Hildebrandt to learn parenting skills from her, so she's the mental health counselor teaching parenting skills to Ruby Franke. And they're also business partners, and Ruby Franke is a parenting coach under Jodi Hildebrandt's supervision. Which is it? Is she a parenting coach? Is she an employee? Or is she a patient or a client? Those are 2 very different roles. And what happens when those 2 roles sort of blur together? That can become very confusing very fast. So if I'm your parenting coach or parenting mental health counselor or whatever I'm doing, and you tell me that you want to take on more parenting coaching clients, even though it's cutting into your time with your kids, as your parenting therapist, I'm going to tell you that's not a great idea because your kids come first. That's not really so fair to them, right? Because as the parenting mental health professional, I'm going to say prioritize your relationship with your kids. As your boss, every parenting client you take on is more money in my pocket. So which am I, your boss or the person who's helping you parent? That can get very confusing. I can see the temptation, right? Because Ruby Franke knows Jodi Hildebrandt's method, which is not approved psychological theory, but we'll get to that in a minute. So therefore she knows it well so she can teach it. I can understand why the temptation and why it sort of made a twisted logic sense to both of them. But in actuality, dual relationships are risky. Also, going on with the dual relationship situation, Jodi Hildebrandt was apparently the parenting mental health professional for Ruby Franke, the individual psychotherapist for some of the kids, and the marriage counselor for Ruby and Kevin Franke. So there's like 3 relationships there. Which are you? Now, there is such a thing as being a family therapist where your client is the family unit and you're working with the family unit trying to strengthen them. And within that, you might occasionally talk about the marriage, you might talk about the parenting, you might talk about the individual mental health of anyone in the system. But your client is the system. You're not the couples counselor, that would be somebody else. You're not the individual therapist for the 16-year-old kid. You're treating the system and you're mostly talking to them together in the same room. Maybe occasionally you'll be like parent with one child, parent with a different child, but the system's your client. That doesn't sound like what Jodi Hildebrandt had set up. Doing marriage counseling and teenager counseling and parenting work and individual psychotherapy with members of a family. And she was also apparently working with relatives of Ruby Franke, like a sibling of hers. That's also a dual relationship, a little too close for comfort. As mental health professionals, we try not to have conflict where I shouldn't be treating a sister and a sister-in-law at the same time because I might know too much and their treatments might blur into one another. And again, whose interests am I representing? What if their interests are not aligned? Then what? That becomes problematic. So this is a giant red flag. Another giant red flag while we're talking about giant red flags is if you have a psychotherapist who suggests your kids moving in with her into her home, please run screaming in the opposite direction and perhaps call the licensing board. This is not approved psychological practice. We have professional boundaries and ethics. I can't think of a single instance in which somebody, a mental health counselor, would invite a patient to live in her home. There are certainly therapeutic homes and therapeutic boarding schools and, hospital units, places where children might live in order to receive psychotherapy. But in those cases, that person didn't start out as their individual psychotherapist and then invite them into a home. They might have an individual psychotherapist who says, this child's needs are greater than can be handled, or this home is very dangerous. The child needs to be removed from the home and the child is put into therapeutic foster care or into a residential treatment center for a specific condition. Usually then they're going to see a different therapist at that residential treatment center. It's very rare that their own therapist is also on staff there, but certainly having a child move into the home of a mental health counselor is another giant red flag that crosses so many professional boundaries that I can't even understand the justification for it. So again, your therapist says, move into my house, please run screaming in the opposite direction really, 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 really fast. The next problem with Jodi Hildebrandt, again, these are all allegations, so I can't speak to the facts of the case, was that many former patients of hers are saying that she disclosed confidential information that they told her in psychotherapy to members of her church and her church leadership, or their church and their church leadership, resulting in people getting kicked out of college programs, resulting in people being censured or publicly disciplined for things they had said in confidence. And in some cases, those things were fabrications, again, allegedly fabrications, that when her notes were requested, the patient did not find any indicator in the notes that he ever even said those things that were then reported that he'd said, that were then told to church leaders. That's a problem. If you have confidentiality, and again, confidentiality, obviously there are limits to confidentiality. If we really believe someone's a danger to themselves or others, there are limits. They're called the Tarasov limitations. And in the first informed consent, going back to that concept, the first psychotherapy session, when we have a conversation about informed consent, we talk about, here are the limits to confidentiality. You tell me you're going to kill yourself, you're going to kill somebody else, you're engaged in abusing someone else, and you don't intend to stop, we're going to have to tell somebody. But the patient knows this, and usually the somebody isn't a church leader. It certainly isn't a college professor. Like, those are not the people we would tell. We might tell the police, we might tell Child Protective Services, we might tell a spouse if that was the agreement, but we're not telling religious leaders. There might be a reason for that, like you go to this congregation and you're a pedophile and they need to know, you've molested someone in the church, sure. But in general, a patient should have an expectation of confidentiality and should know the limits to confidentiality prior or at their first psychotherapy session. This is something they should discuss, and if they have questions, they should be allowed to discuss those questions with the therapist and maybe say, forget it, this therapy is not for me. We're then going to move to the interesting conflation that Jodi Hildebrandt seemed to have between her religion and her psychotherapy. She seemed to use a lot of spiritual concepts and didn't really differentiate between what was a theological concept and what was a psychological concept. So in her program Connection, she talked about this thing she called distortions, which somehow remove you from connections. And the way she would capitalize the word truth sounded very religious, right? Like very often in religious and spiritual writings, truth, as in God's truth, is capitalized. So this idea that somehow distortions take one away from God's truth, that sounds kind of theological. That doesn't really sound like psychology. I think there is certainly an idea that in her concept of distortions, it's anything that removes you from living your life authentically and being fully present in your life. So, for example, electronics, video games. But then she also talked about too close of an attachment to your spouse, being too in love with your spouse or with your kids, being too in love with material possessions, things like that, where what's too attached to your kids? That kind of thing does sound much more theological than psychological. I think it's true that any coping tool that's relied on excessively can become an obsession and can be more harmful than productive, sure. But this idea of distortions doesn't really come from any psychological theory. I think there's a concept of cognitive distortions that comes from CBT, this idea but that has nothing to do with coping tools. Cognitive distortions are when we have certain thoughts, like I must do this, or if I don't do this, my boss will fire me, where we are distorted in our thinking about the world. Really? Will your boss really fire you if you don't say yes to this bonus project? Maybe he'll just be a little bit annoyed, but he'll be fine with it. So that's what a cognitive distortion in cognitive behavioral therapy would be. But that doesn't seem to have anything to do with a distortion being something that you rely on, like a video game. Just seems to be a conflation of two ideas, one theological, one psychological, that don't quite go together. So in terms of that, using the language of psychotherapy, like using terms like narcissism and attachment, and then conflating them with your own theories without saying, this is my own theory that I made up out of the clear blue sky and is not really based on anything. Because I think sometimes, of course, we do speculate as mental health professionals. We sometimes will see a scene in a movie and we'll say, oh, this really reminds me of this psychological process. Or we have our own take or our own spin on things. I use the concept of a trauma app to understand how trauma works in our brain. But we have to localize. That's me. I made that up. That comes from my understanding. This is my metaphor for understanding this concept. Not that this concept is real and verified and absolutely, from some higher form of truth. I think we also need to be clear, particularly in the realm of pastoral counseling or spiritual counseling. I think it's really important for anybody who is engaging in pastoral or spiritual counseling to very clearly label what they're doing, like what hat they're wearing. So if somebody is a pastoral counselor with no mental health training, they need to say very clearly, I am a spiritual advisor. This is not, I have no mental health training. Maybe I have a lot of spiritual training. Maybe I've been through something similar, so I can advise you. But you need to know, not actually a licensed mental health professional, versus someone who's a mental health professional who's then using spiritual terms, who needs to say that I am talking as a mental health professional and I am relating to these spiritual practices, or I'm going to talk about some spiritual ideas, but from the lens of being a mental health professional. I think it's very important to make that distinction and that differentiation. Which hat are you wearing? Out of which literature are you pulling? Are you pulling from the Bible? Or are you pulling from psychology? Just so that people know what they're getting. Because again, that goes back to the whole idea of informed consent. And I think the most scary thing of this entire story is Ruby Franke had her 8 Passengers channel for a really long time. And people were raising concerns about some of the parenting practices she was using, the harsh punishment, the shaming, the lack of concern for kids' basic safety, like giving them food or a bed. And yet her channel kept going and going and going. And sounds like CPS came to investigate, Child Protective Services, whatever it's called in her state, came to investigate. But here's the scary thing. Because the kids appeared well fed, because the kids appeared clean, because the home appeared well tended, and because Ruby Franke was well spoken, CPS didn't really look into those allegations the way they should have. And I think that says something about our lack of understanding that emotional abuse is abuse, that shaming and criticizing and denigrating a child, rejecting a child, making them feel unsafe, those things are abuse too. Abuse isn't only slapping someone across the face or beating someone with a belt till they can't sit down. Abuse isn't only child exploitation because you're molesting them. Child exploitation can also happen by making them shoot a video for pull-ups, right? There's a lot of ways that a child can be exploited. And I don't think we fully embrace the way emotional abuse is abuse. I think sometimes because it's harder to quantify and it's harder to, there's no formal forensic scale for child emotional abuse, we don't necessarily have the language for it. So while I understand why Child Protective Services came down to the home and saw a well-tended home with children that appeared healthy and a mother who was well-spoken and no visible bruises, so they left because probably there was nothing on their checklist that made them say, oh, this is emotional abuse, because right now their checklist doesn't include emotional abuse. I think we all have to think very hard about that. In our own homes, talking meanly to a kid can cross a red line. We have to think hard about the fact that in some ways the whole world, 2 million people were bystanders to what was going on, but because it didn't look like the standard classical abuse of beating a kid with a belt or, something else that's egregious, some other form of neglect that's egregious, a lot of people looked away. And I think a lot of people didn't. There was a change.org petition. There were apparently a lot of social media outcries about it. But we have to get better at identifying emotional abuse. And hopefully this story, because of course in the end of the story, one of Ruby Franke's kids actually escaped Jodi Hildebrandt's home, ran to a neighbor, had duct tape around his ankles, looked malnourished. The police report said severely malnourished, was hungry and thirsty, wearing clothing that was too big, barefoot, ran out of Jodi Hildebrandt's home, ran to a neighbor. And these are houses that are very far apart. So it was quite, the feat to escape and get to the neighbor's house. So then it got to the level of, oh, this is clearly abuse. But it already was abuse for a very long time. And for those of us post-traumatic parents who are watching this story because maybe it reminds us of experiences in our childhood, maybe we are so triggered by the story, we have that train wreck phenomenon where we can't look away. I think what we learn from this story is red flags in mental health counselors. We learn about informed consent. We learn about respecting kids' autonomy and rights. And we learn about how easy it is to forget our values when there are pressures like social media algorithms getting involved. And I think even more importantly is look at those red flags that Jodi Hildebrandt displayed so that you and your kids never end up with an unscrupulous mental health professional. Here's my time to say that YouTube is not psychotherapy. Nothing that I said on this channel is at all a substitute for meeting a licensed mental health professional who's licensed in your jurisdiction and who specializes in helping you deal with whatever you're bringing to the table. If you like this content, please subscribe, maybe let a friend know. Please message me. You can find me on Instagram at Dr. Kozlowitz Psychology. You can find the Post-Traumatic Parenting podcast. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. The Targeted Parenting blog is on Psychology Today. You can find me on LinkedIn and on drrobinkoslowitz.com as well. Thanks so much for the gift of your attention today. Till next time.